Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight for our final DEI session in this series. Our session this evening is Common Implicit Biases in Higher Ed and How to Mitigate the Impact. So something I think we definitely all are interested in and could use a little more information on. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Ashley Wallace, and she's an Assistant Director of Education and Outreach for the Laboratory of Research on the Structure of Matter at University of Pennsylvania. Wow, that is very impressive. And I have so many questions about that, but I'll hold them until another time and turn it over to you, Dr. Wallace, to get started.
Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen so we can get started. Everything showing up okay?
Yep.
Yes. Okie dokie. So I first want to start off by thanking you all for lending me your time tonight. I know it's a beautiful, somewhat summer, somewhat introduction to summer, I guess I'll say, weather outside, and you could be outside enjoying it, but you decided to enjoy your night with me. So I appreciate, you being here. And so as the introduction states, my name is Dr. Ashley Wallace. And so we're going to talk about some things that you may be familiar with. You may have some learning to do in this space, but we'll get to all of that. So I first want to start off by just posing this question to the group to see where everyone is, and see what's one question you want answered by the end of today's session. So if you want to take a moment, share, you can unmute yourself, or if you want to just put it in the chat, that would be great. But I just want to see what's one question or something that you're curious about and hope that we can address in the session today.
I think one question that I have is it possible to get to a place where these things aren't as prevalent as they are?
Okay, so can we get to a place where implicit bias is not as prevalent as they are currently, correct? All right. Either one works. I usually have the kids call me Dr. Wallace, but Jack, you can feel free to call me Ashley if you like.
Sure. I misunderstood. I thought you said you meant your kids, but
oh no, I'm sorry, the students.
The students, yeah. All good. Sounds good. Thank you, Ash.
So Pat says, how do we reach those who claim they have no implicit biases? Okay, yeah, that's a good question. Okay. And then Shayna, I hope I'm saying that correctly. How do we recognize implicit bias in ourselves and help others recognize it in themselves? Okay, cool. Good questions. Does anybody else have a question they would like to?
It's not as much a question as maybe just knowledge for me, but in terms of hiring practices and how implicit bias may affect different hiring practices in higher ed specifically.
Mm-hmm. So how does implicit bias probably play a role or impact the hiring process?
Yeah. And how can we change that?
Right. Okay. All right. So thank you all for participating and sharing. And so if there are any questions that come up, definitely feel free to put them in the chat. And then I will also share my contact information for those who would like to continue this conversation even after the session is done. And so just to kind of give you all a roadmap of what tonight's session will look like, we'll talk about how we can increase our understanding of implicit biases and their influence on relationships and interactions. We'll kind of talk about it generally, but then we'll also dive deeper and talk about how this is present specifically in higher education. We'll talk about how to recognize the impact of conscious and unconscious assumptions, preconceptions, biases, and prejudices. And then we'll also kind of close out the session by identifying some practical strategies that we can use for recognizing and mitigating the challenges to create more inclusive environments, again, specifically tailoring that to higher education. And so I know that conversations like these can be kind of uncomfortable sometimes for some people. So I do want to kind of pose to y'all some things to kind of make sure that we create a safe space for tonight's session, right? So I want to I want you as well as myself to encourage and support constructive behaviors, be respectful of each other, listen to understand. That includes challenging the idea and not necessarily the person. Be empathetic, value each other's experiences. And then last but not least, don't be afraid to ask questions. The more questions we ask, the better chances we are of having a discussion around it to hopefully provide new perspective, different perspectives. And then that's the way that we grow, right? And so can we agree to keep these in mind and do these things today? You can give me a thumbs up. You can give me a head nod if you. Okay, I see some thumbs up, some head nods. Cool. All right. So that's great to hear. I appreciate everyone being, a part of this experience. And that's the best way for us to do that, is to make sure that we create that safe space. And so continuing on. So what I'm going to do now is put some words on the screen, and I want you to kind of just take a moment and just whatever images come to mind, just take note of that. And then we'll have a discussion about it. And so what comes to mind, what images come to mind, thoughts come to mind when you see the word cook, mountain climber, caretaker, politician? What about a graduate student? A faculty member, and this can be adjunct or tenured. First generation, low income. A graduate of a historically Black college or university. Or a graduate from a predominantly white institution. Would anybody like to share an idea of an image that came to mind for any of these listed?
So, Dr. Wallace's guys, as soon as I saw mountain climber, I immediately thought of a plaid shirt.
Okay. Plaid shirt for the
And I love plaid
climber?
shirts. I love plaid shirts, but I thought of a plaid shirt.
Okay. Anybody else?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Sorry.
we
I
can
had Zoom problems for. I as a mother, caretaker struck out to me as someone that's a woman, a motherly figure. So that's
When I saw a politician, I thought of old white people.
Okay. Anyone else want to share?
When I saw mountain climber, it was immediately like a skinny or a thin white dude with a beard. And for predominantly white institution, it just, for some reason, what came to mind was like the Ivy Leagues and just somebody in a blazer who probably might not be the nicest person.
Interesting. Yeah.
Very big stereotype, but
Janine, mine was the same one. Sorry to jump in. Mine was the exact one. I picture like my dad is a lawyer type of energy.
right. Like, do you know who my dad is?
Exactly. It was the type of high school I went to, so my brain goes immediately.
Right.
So if I can jump in, I had a fairly positive first thought for all of them. But I know this is going to totally expose my naivete here, but I'm trusting I'm in a good group. I really want to know more what it means when I see the words together, first generation low income. Because I'm looking at that not necessarily knowing if there's another meaning behind it, but I'm thinking like that person has busted their butt and they are like somebody you want with you because they are overcoming challenges. But then I thought, oh no, is this somebody who is the reverse? Like they've been in a wealthy situation and now they're the first time they're low income. So I'm sorry if you could just give me a little explanation.
Yeah, so I will say in higher education, first generation low income means someone who's coming from an environment that wasn't necessarily
Okay.
it didn't necessarily give them access to the resources that other
Sure.
people have. So
Okay.
because they're navigating this space, probably, well, in this case, the first person in their family to go to college didn't have access to resources that
Okay.
other people might have had. Their experiences would be a little different, and their knowledge
Sure.
of the higher education system is starting from a different place.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Mhm.
Well, I want to hire that person. I do.
Actually,
I do.
And yes, for sure.
actually, quick question.
Mhm.
This is it a term generally reserved for students and more specifically traditional aged students?
So I will say in my experience, because I do work with students, that's where we tend to direct a lot of the resources that we have available to these students. Not saying that other students don't have access to it, but sometimes we tend to put together special programs knowing that these students don't have a lot of the knowledge that they should have to navigate the higher education system. But I would say that it's not reserved specifically for students to use. So I identify as a first generation low income individual as I was navigating the education system as a student. Does that make sense?
It does, thank you. And just to clarify, and generally it's for students who are within that traditional age group, right? Like 18,
Yes.
19, 20, that age group and stuff like that, right?
Traditionally, yes,
Okay.
but there's a lot of just like what you'll see with just research in general. And there are things changing all the time in academia. So there's the change in language as well. So because there's more studies being done on non-traditional students, thinking about how they identify, because that's one of the other things is you don't want to label somebody when they don't necessarily identify as that. So thinking about how they self-identify and then using the terms and the language that individuals use to introduce themselves to the community. Okay. So we're gonna move right along. I didn't realize like the time is going by so fast. But I again want to thank you all for giving perspective. And so it's very interesting. You know, I noticed that Deborah in particular, she did not mention certain aspects when she talked about the first generation low income. And then we call them we use the acronym FIGLY when we're referring to first generation low income. But then there were some people who, you know, went into more detail. There was mention of gender, race. There was a mention of a body shape or a size. But these are things to think about, right? So there are certain times when words come up where there are immediately images that pop into our heads. And then there are other times where it's a little bit more vague, right? And so even for this session, when, you know, you might have thought about what I might have looked like, or you might have saw the picture. But then even thinking about who am I? What about me, right? And so if you were to ask me, would you think that I was somebody who was interested in sports? You know, I love basketball, football, softball, tennis, all the things, but then I'm also a chemist by trade, right? I'm a proud graduate of a historically Black college, but then I'm also a proud graduate of a predominantly white institution. And even going a step further, I'm now employed by the University of Penn. And so just putting it out there is, you know, regardless of what someone may think about me, regardless of someone's opinion, I'm still all of these things. And even though I'm all of these things, I'm so much more. So now that we've kind of thought about, you know, our opinions and things of that nature, let's now think about and explore how these opinions can then turn into implicit bias and how they might show up in higher education. And so implicit bias is just another way of saying unconscious bias, right? So it's these attitudes and beliefs that occur outside of our conscious minds and awareness, and they show up because we have these influences in our lives, whether or not it's family, friends, and one of the big things being the media. So if we were to look at just high level, I'm not sure how many people saw this article or these articles around the time that Hurricane Katrina happened, but if you look at the top image and the caption that accompanied that, it says a young man walks through chest deep flood water after looting a grocery store in New Orleans. And then a similar image, also taken during Hurricane Katrina, shows two individuals, and then, well, the accompanying caption says two residents wade through chest deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store after Hurricane Katrina came through the area in New Orleans, Louisiana. So if we're looking at these images, we're looking at the captions, there's an obvious difference in the language that's being used to describe the situation. And then if you're looking at the images, there's a clear and evident difference in the physical appearance of one person versus the other two in the bottom photo, right? And so if we're talking about higher ed, this can look like making assumptions about a student's learning behaviors, their capability of academic success, and then tying the assumptions to the students' identities and their backgrounds. And these assumptions can then impact the student's ability to grow. And so when you think about your assumptions and think about the impact, some questions might be, how can these differences impact the relationships that we have? You know, how may these differences pose challenges to some of the relationships that we have within higher ed, whether that's a mentoring relationship, a teaching relationship, a colleague to colleague relationship? How are these things showing up in the workplace and in the setting? And then how does one develop an appreciation for the differences among the individuals in the situation, right? Because diversity plays a role in all of these things that we're discussing. And so just kind of giving you all some foundation, there's a lot of work and a lot of studies that focuses on how implicit biases show up in higher ed. So this particular study here was studying how hiring involved assigning a man's name versus a woman's name to the same application. And then what they did was they distributed the applications randomly to a group of reviewers to see what their responses would be, to see what their next steps would be. And what they found was the reviewers were actually more likely to hire the man or to hire the person that had a man's name on the application. And so then going into more work and more studies, even thinking about like how we saw the differences in the language that's used, thinking about how the language that's used in higher education also has an impact, right? So this study was looking at a number of letters of recommendations for hiring someone into a lucrative position at a major medical school. And so what they saw is that the male candidates were often referred to as researchers and colleagues, whereas the women were often referred to as teachers and students. And then even going a step further, they saw that there were 4 times more likely to reference a woman's personal lives in these letters versus in the men, they didn't do so much, right? And so these quote unquote ended up having more conversations and then raised doubts, quote unquote, about the woman being able to actually do the job for this position. And so then
Actually, I'm so sorry. Before you
yeah,
go on,
go
when you
ahead.
say more doubt raisers, what can you just say a bit more on that for me when you say doubt raisers? A couple
Right.
examples,
So
yeah.
doubt raisers being that, you know, if a woman is trying to have this position, but then also have a family, what would the time commitment that she would be able to give to the position and the needs of those within this office? Would she have to leave early? Would she be able to give her energy, her time, and her thoughts the way that they presume needed to be done for this position and for someone to be successful in that position? And so this study here was pretty interesting to me as well. And so this one was literally looking at faculty members receiving emails from fictional prospective doctoral students, right? And emphasis on fictional. But what was happening was they were trying to see what the faculty members' responses would be if that student were to request a meeting, you know, that day or in the very near future. And what they did in this study is they assigned names that are often connected to certain races, whether that's Caucasian, African American, Hispanic, on, and associated with certain gender types. And so what they saw is the faculty members' responses to the request of Caucasian men were granted access 26% more often than women and minorities that also asked for these meetings. The Caucasian males also received faster responses, and then even accepting the meetings from the Caucasians versus the minority groups were very different. And so it shows that, you know, even when looking at things as our response times, they can also be swayed by certain things that we may not necessarily be consciously thinking about. And so so just thinking about how these biases show up, and I'm sorry, somebody just joined the room. But yeah, just there's, even with the research that I'm showing you through the examples that I provided, there's a lot more information out there and studies being done on looking at how implicit bias and assumptions can affect things like evaluations and assessments of applications, how individuals evaluate articles that are being submitted to research journals. Again, the language and the structure of recommendations, and even thinking about how these have impact on the selections of presenters and who's being invited to the conversation, who's being invited to campus. And so it's important that we think about these things as we are navigating these spaces. And so I want to go into another little short activity where I want you to sit and reflect on a couple more things, and then we'll come back and have a conversation about it in the larger group, because I think that, again, that's where we really do some some deep diving, and by having different perspectives and different ideas, I think we can actually really center some of those questions that came about in the earlier portion of the session. And so I want you to think about these three things, right? So how would you go about engaging someone in a discussion about their race, ethnicity, class, gender, if they have a visible or invisible, or not so visible disability, their age, background, values, or perspectives? How do you engage in a conversation with those things in mind without you feeling or expressing a sense of judgment about the differences? And what are some risks for addressing or not addressing the diversity directly? And then lastly, how can you view diversity as an asset? Even though we're thinking about implicit bias, it's all because there's something that's different about this other person than it is about us, right? And so that's diverse, that's diversity. And so how can you view this as an asset? And so I'll give you all about 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and debrief and have a conversation about it. So, oh yeah. Okay, so I'm interested to hear, would anybody like to share their thoughts about either or any of the points here? Yes, Cameron, I see your hand.
Hey, I think a big part of it, or at least for me personally, is like setting the tone with the conversation. So just knowing that if it is going to be difficult, prefacing that with like, hey, my 4 rules are like no shame, no blame, no guilt, no judgment, whatever. I mean, we're having a difficult conversation to learn. So just always keeping that in mind and kind of leading into it, knowing it's going to be difficult and challenging, but that's not why we're doing it. We're doing it to try and, sorry, learn a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's taking ownership for knowing where the gaps in your knowledge are, and trying to create a safe space, and setting the stage for the conversation at the beginning. Okay. Anyone else want to share?
I would say,
Pat has his.
I was gonna say Pat and then Shauna.
So with the first question, I thought of a couple of times in my work as a career coach where a client has disclosed a learning disability or a disability relating to information processing, which is rarely visible. And I sort of felt like, well, okay, it's really important that we talk about that. So that way, the way we're communicating, the way I'm structuring assignments or that process, make sure it accommodates how that person best receives or processes information. So, just sort of affirming like, hey, I'm grateful that you disclosed that. Can we talk about it a little bit? Because this is what's now on my mind. And I want to learn from you how this best serves you, and try to make it feel like a safe space to name when it's not working. So that way we can learn how that can work best together, and sort of own the gaps in my knowledge and my background.
Mm-hmm. So I heard you say one piece is acknowledging that they are sharing this information. 2 is taking the time to question how you can support them through what it is that they're proposing or presenting, and then partnering with them in a way that fits their style so that you are able to help, right? Those are great.
Yes.
That's great. I like it.
yeah, I don't really want to go after that one. Thanks, Pat.
No.
But I was just saying I would try to like start by like asking broad questions, be a very active listener. So I can try to help gauge their comfort level in the questions that I'm asking. And then like similar to what Pat said, just like being supportive of how they're feeling with the discussion, and how I can help make them feel more comfortable with the discussion that we're having. And that's probably partly true, I do that for myself as well in that conversation. But that's what I was thinking.
Yeah. So again, acknowledging, creating the safe space, being an active listener. I really like that part. I think that plays a very, very big role in using the language that they use in the situation to then share with them what you've heard and things of that nature. So yeah, I think that's a good one as well.
And then I saw Luke, and then I think Deborah. Oh, and Jack.
Yeah, I was just highlighting the importance of what Pat just said. I thought he made a lot of really, really great points when it came to individuals with learning disabilities. I believe you phrased it, disabilities that aren't necessarily seen, or like if you don't have a lot of exposure to them, you wouldn't know. Like you wouldn't know that person has a disability. So yeah, that's what I was doing. I was using the clap emoji just to highlight how important that was, what you just mentioned.
So Pat, you got people on your team. They agree. So I'm not sure if we have anyone else, but I'm curious to know, because this is an alumni group, if I'm not mistaken. So how do we even think about, the creating a space for alumni to join the association, letting them know that there's a space for them to be present. How do we create that through, or are there any ideas about how to create that through conversation, through activities?
So I was kind of answered the third one. But my kind of role through this lens, I guess my role is really to increase alumni engagement and connection to Temple. And so I think making sure, having diversity across the team is really important. So whether it's age, race, ethnicity, values, backgrounds, just to help ensure that we're thinking with a lens of inclusion across our alumni populations when we're developing programming and engaging our alumni. And so I was kind of looking at it with that lens of like making sure that we have diversity on the team, so that can come through in some of our programming and offerings that way.
I like it. So having representation, so that the diversity is part of the planning process and part of the structure of the organization.
I do think that, and I feel like we hear this a lot, that there's a lot of groups that don't feel connected to Temple. They have a Temple experience, but they may not associate with being part of one of our established groups, whether it's regional or a Black Alumni Alliance or a Women's Network or the different programming we have. So it's always, how do we continue to engage those that want to connect and associate with Temple, but maybe don't feel 100% comfortable coming out in the ways that we've established. So how do we kind of balance that and continue to have people feel connected to Temple?
Yeah. And maybe it's a conversation, right? Maybe it's a conversation about what that experience was for them, and how to reframe, or I guess in a sense, see how this experience as an alumni can be different or more supportive, or how you can benefit and learn from those experiences, to then push this organization to do and be supportive on the post-graduation side. I like that as well. Anyone else?
I have.
Yeah, Deborah.
I'm with the Tyler School of Art and Architecture alumni, and we actually just had a conversation that was sort of around these questions, which is how do you gain more feedback from people, or getting them to join the alumni and be more involved. And one of the things that people pointed out is some of the reasons why a lot of people don't do it, no matter what their gender, class, ethnicity, etc., is time and oftentimes money as well. Because if you have to, give up an hour or two, you might need to have to pay a babysitter, and that might be hard to find one or pay for one or whatever. You can imagine all of that. So we've actually had discussions that are more about kind of reaching out to students and seeing if they just want to be someone who's willing to have, a 20-minute phone call, a 15-minute phone call to share their ideas that we can take back to the group. Obviously there's some trust there, right? That we're going to bring back their message and not with our tainting. Or if they want to do something in writing, which I think I'm veering away from your overall intent of the discussion for these items, but that's how we looked at ways of engaging with everybody.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, though I think what you're saying still gets to how to have those conversations, right? So there may be someone in the group who finds that useful to know that if we do want to explore the different experiences, and we don't want to assume that, oh, this is why so and so or this group or this individual isn't a part of the association, we need to ask them, we need to have those conversations. So I think, Deborah, what you're saying is still valid, it's still important, because we do have to learn about what everyone else's experiences are in order to then have conversations about how we can support without making the assumptions.
And I just wanted to say real quick, just to Deborah's point, I was listening to something, it has to do with internships, but it kind of pertains to the work that we do. And this idea that unpaid internships really only bring in those who can actually afford unpaid internships, right? And so you're getting a certain group of people that are coming in, they're getting these unpaid internships and then generally getting the jobs because they've been able to do these unpaid internships. And so you're kind of financially cutting out a whole section of people that just can't afford this, and if you paid internships, you get a better mix and all of that. But same thing goes for volunteers, right? It's who can afford to give their time, to give their energy, who can, whereas it might be more of a struggle for somebody else who still has a lot to offer, but just doesn't have the ability to engage. So then we have to figure out how do we make it easier for them?
Yeah.
And I just want to point out, I know I said this, I just want to point out that just having young children, no matter who you are, can be something that holds you back because you're split with your time. So even if you can afford a babysitter, maybe you don't want to. So sometimes people's contributions aren't seen because they are just not in a position to be able to contribute.
Yeah.
Jack, I want to say something, but Jack, I think I saw your hand up a couple times. So before I add.
Oh, no, actually, please go ahead. I was thinking of something from earlier, but I'm trying to reformulate for where Ashley had taken this. But please, guys, go ahead.
Thank you. Really quick. I really want to underscore what Janine said in terms of the internship piece, right? Because when we really think of the cycle that it creates, and many of our programs at the university are pushing more internships, right? If we really think about it, because we want to give students that experiential learning, right? We want them to go out there in the field. But a lot of these internships are with some of nonprofit organizations, and they do not get paid. And then when we think of our temporal population, we have a number of students who are actually working full time, right? And taking classes. So what we're actually asking students to do is give up your full-time employment to do an internship that's more aligned with your career. Or shift your hours where you're getting paid to work at night so that you can do the daytime hours for the unpaid internship and then still come to school the next day. It is very challenging and problematic when many of our programs are moving in this direction of internships, experiential learning, and not really putting the same importance on paid internships.
Yeah, and just to chime in on that as well, we see that a lot with the traditional Figley students, the first generation low income, is that they are having to support themselves, right? And so they're having to work 1 to 2 jobs, maybe even more, so that they can buy books, so that they can afford food, so that they can pay rent. So we do see that they are not able to take on the internships that don't pay as much, and they ask more questions about, where about the internships that may not necessarily align with their goals, but pays more, right? And so they're not tapping into the networks the same as someone who has the access to the same resources. And so even thinking about, my taking that into consideration in my position where I'm evaluating applications, even thinking about, okay, what type of experiences are we saying are most important versus what are the skills that are important, and how does that show up in other positions? So that, say for instance, there are students who might have an opportunity to do research because they're at a school that has the foundation for them to do really heavy hands-on experimentation, because they have access to instruments, they have access to materials, whereas someone who's from a smaller school might not necessarily get that opportunity because of, situations where there's limited slots available to do research at their home institution, or there just isn't any resources to support that. So taking on the internship conversation, the conversations about how we can think about what is important and how we can support individuals who may not necessarily have access to the same opportunities. I think this is all connected in some way, and it's very important to think about, especially in higher ed. These are some great conversations, y'all. Gosh.
This also made me think a little bit too. Sorry, Jack, you just had your head up and I went.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Kitty. I'll go after you.
Are we in the alumni relations or advancement engagement, are we unintentionally creating barriers potentially for alumni to engage? I know we talked about like actively seeking feedback. Is it, are we offering the right mix of date and time, registration fee, digital content versus like live in-person content? I know that that's a puzzle that we're always trying to solve, but, thinking about, what are we charging and at what time? Is it the weekend? This is just kind of got me thinking a little bit of my own time, but like, what does that reflect in other people's time and needs? So that's just a thought that has bubbled up through this conversation. So,
well, I thank you for sharing, Katie. So was it Jack? I'm going through. Jack, did you have something? And then we're a little under 10 minutes, so want to finish up. So we'll take Jack and then we'll close out the session.
Yeah, I'll be brief, actually. One thing that one theme that's been coming to my mind about this is validation. It seems a lot of like what kind of, cuts across, all of the currents here that I've been thinking of is like, do we take enough time, for companies to validate, like, are we doing the right thing by offering an unpaid internship? Or to Katie, to your point, are we doing the right thing by, when we, how we structure programming and creating space to validate? So then it's like, well, it may not necessarily be a challenge, but from somebody's bias, but if we're not asking the question, then it completely gets overlooked. And then I think I saw Dr. Blue, you mentioned like the micro or meritocracy microaggression that comes up of like, well, then if things are just kind of expected like this, then I'm expected to do this and not ask questions, and it creates this whole kind of thing where nothing is validated, and it perpetuates a whole system for people. So Yeah, validation. I don't know. I feel like that there could be more of that, and that I think is a huge asset to the last question of like, where diversity can be an asset, just to validate things for people.
I agree wholeheartedly. So I thank you, Jack, for sharing that and giving us some ideas and some things to think about in your perspective. But I wholeheartedly agree that validation plays a big role in this as well. So thank you all for sharing. I really do appreciate it. So as I promised, I'm going to share a couple of strategies, but we've kind of talked about some of these terms. You might be familiar with them. But one term that I did want to share with you all is this sense of double consciousness. And if you're unfamiliar with it, it's the intersectionality that a lot of non-majority individuals feel, where they're competing to negotiate between two worlds. So their own world, where their culture, their family, their environment plays a major role in how they present themselves or how they see themselves, how they identify, but then they're also navigating the majority world and the majority consciousness, right? And so they're navigating that in survival mode. And so again, just wanting to bring this to the forefront for everyone to consider and to think about as you're navigating the space, especially in higher ed. I can say that a lot of students feel this, a lot of individuals go through this, where they're trying to navigate the world and present themselves as their full selves, but there's this constant internal battle. And so as far as strategies, we kind of talked about some of these things. Definitely the respect, and that comes from the language that you use. History has shown us that words are very powerful. They've played a role in rights movements for decades. And we really have to acknowledge the fact that the historical wrongs are constantly being perpetuated through language, right? Whether that's classism, racism, religious persecution, etc. And it can really result, especially, and present itself in detrimental ways within higher ed, especially. Since we're talking about higher ed, learning is a big thing. So you want to continue exploring opportunities where you can learn about different cultures, engage with different cultures, whether that's getting to know women and minority colleagues in your department, on campus, professional associations, because this will show you the biases that you have. This will bring about awareness. And then we talked about active listening, right? So listen to the experiences. Don't just dismiss them and disregard them. Really listen to what the experiences are, and then try to see how you can change or how you can, I guess, in a sense, empathize with the situation. And then lastly, you want to think about how you can collaborate, how you can include different viewpoints when you're developing strategies and objectives to ensure that the work that you do is unbiased. And so I know we've been through a lot of different things over the course of this hour. And one thing was, how can we bring awareness to others? How can we bring awareness to ourselves? And the thing is that it's all about awareness, right? So when we talked about and we went through the different words, there are things that just instantly pop up for us in some cases, and that's okay. It's good to acknowledge that the bias is there. It's what you do with that bias. Does that bias present itself in a way that it's impacting your ability to include people, to work with people, and then how can you then change the bias into something that's more productive for yourself and the other people that's around you. So there is no one size fits all type of situation or type of answer to this situation. It's going to look different because everyone is different. So I encourage you to explore what other areas and ideas or other ways that you can create an inclusive environment. And so my thing is that I'm hopeful that the points raised in this session and this discussion make a case for why many different types of diversity are crucial, especially within higher ed. Academia, the foundation of academia is advancement of knowledge and innovation. And so it's very important for us to think about how representation can be present. We want to think about and be mindful of situations that you make you and or others vulnerable to stereotype, threat, microaggressions, and the implicit biases. I encourage you and challenge you to remember that we all carry these unconscious assumptions, and they don't need to be a source of guilt. And we talked about the learning process, talked about being aware of our biases, but I encourage you to discuss them with others, to raise your awareness and think about how they can become conscious, how you can become more conscious of them and minimize their impact on your behavior. And then lastly, I encourage you to consider some of the ideas and strategies that we talked about. Even try some of the strategies if you feel that you want to try them out, because the only way that you'll know they work is if you try it out, and then you can make changes to them as needed. So that's all that I have for today. I again thank you all for being here. I hope this was a fruitful experience. I really appreciate the participation. And at this time, if there's any last comments or questions, I will take those.